Hi, everybody. It's Katie Joe here with Sovereign Soul Podcast. And this podcast is dedicated to the understanding that we all have the right and even the freedom and responsibility to be our own spiritual sovereignty in the world and to make the choices and discernment as to what spirituality is for us. So, today I want to talk about the perception that's one of my biggest pet peeves. And one of my biggest pet peeves is that God is always referred to as He. Now, I was raised in a Christian Latter-day Saint home, which is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint, but most commonly understood as Mormon. And so we had not just the Bible, we also had the Book of Mormon and then the Pearl of Great Price. And all of this was allegedly translated by Joseph Smith, who was considered and deemed a prophet of his time. Now, when I read the scriptures and when I read the Bible, notice that it's always saying, be a good son. He said, he said, he said, he said. And my question is who said God is Mel? And where did we decide that God is a Mel? Now, in the Kabbalah, in the tree of life, in the Kabbalah, it goes through different concepts of the Sephirot, which is the ascension of enlightenment. And I'm not an expert on this at all, but you kind of go through this cycle, going through one section to the other or one status to the next. And through it all is meant to be the full scope of how we reach enlightenment and like nirvana, or that state of knowing all that there is to know in this experience. So when you follow that Kabbalah, you get to the second tier from the top. And in the second tier of the top, there is the divine masculine and there's the divine feminine. And that second level. And in the Kabbalah, in that tree of life, they are equal standing. But then the level above that is actually no male, no female, it's the one. And the one separates itself to know the masculine side of itself, to know the feminine side of itself. And through that becomes creation. Through that becomes the then creation of a new reality. So the very highest level of all that is, there is no gender. So when I think about why would God, and I'm not saying that the Kabbalah is true because no one knows, right? But it's these philosophical points. So when we think about in the afterlife, pre-existence or afterlife, does gender matter? Why is gender relevant? Are we male? Are we female when there are no physical bodies? Because when we come down here to Earth and we're looking at Earth and we're looking at this body and we experience this body, part of the experience is balancing the masculine and feminine within ourselves. And this is beyond what sex we were born as. This is simply understanding that there are times that I have masculine attributes and there are times that I have feminine attributes. And we see through kind of what I would say the base level caveman idea that whoever's the biggest and strongest and most physically domineering is the one who's in charge. And to me, that's the most caveman mentality. Now, is it relative and is it important? Absolutely. Because if we look at the history of the earth, we see that it was important at one time in a world where your intelligence wasn't as important as being able to fight off a saber-toothed tiger, but also your intelligence taught you to hunt and to hide and how to hunt that tiger. So it was kind of the two of that together, but it all came down to kind of this physical dimension where we're mastering the physical. But through the evolvement of humanity, we ended up valuing not just being big and strong, but also intellect, but also thought theories, but philosophy, poetry, art, all of these things. So we've expanded through these levels of value of what it is to have the human experience. So when I think about those are masculine attributes, which is I'm going to muscle through, I'm going to set a clear direction, I'm going to do this. This is considered a masculine aspect. But feminine aspects are being fluid, being emotional, being kind, being able to nurture. Now, see, this has nothing to do with the sex that you are. It has to do with the reality that we have both of these within us. We have both masculine and feminine attributes that are here to balance us so that we can learn the true mastery of this world. So, where in the world did the concept that God is a male come in? And I don't know that there's ever an idea of where that came specifically, but across shamanism, across the world, across all esoteric teachings from the top of the planet down to the bottom, there's always been this understanding that there's something more out there. There is something in what's called the ethers at times. There is something more to just this physical experience. And in this oneness, in this beyondness, we can communicate with this and we can be in a personal relationship with this. And when we have a personal relationship with this, then when we see the interconnectedness of all, and when we see that there is something more that is out there that's entwined with the human experience, then we understand and we call that, or it has been called many names, but we call that in most modern days as God. So if we look at history where we come from this caveman mentality, where whoever was the strongest, whoever was the biggest was the one who got to mate with as many females as he wanted to. And those who were the strongest and the meanest and the most overpowering were the ones who got to decide for everybody how life worked and how the village or the tribe worked. There was this understanding. So if I was during those times and I said there is a force or a power that is all powerful and it exists beyond, and it's out there and it's interwoven with everything and it is deciding the triumphs and tragedies of my life, it is all of this. And then physically, I'm in a society that's in a caveman mentality, which means the biggest and the strongest is the one in charge. So then I have these two concepts that I need to weave together. And those two concepts that I need to weave together are this oneness, this thing that I can't describe, but I know that it's there, is all powerful. And then through my perception of the human realm, I see, well, the people who are most powerful are typically the males. They're the ones that get to be in charge and they get to decide everything. Then automatically, when I say this is God, and of course, God is male, then it would make sense. That's where we would say the idea that this force, this creation, would become this perception of God is male, and that would be perpetuated. And we look at societies and we look at history, and there's no way in ancient societies that, in fact, the people that did even pretend to say, what if this source is more than just male? I'm not even saying that it's female because I don't think it's one or the other. But what if it's not just male? I mean, these people were burned and killed, and we must always honor the male god, the male god, the male god. Now, this is different when we look through gods and goddesses, when we look through Grecian culture and all this, where they had many deities. But even in those systems, the head of even all of those deities, we look at Greek mythology or we look at Roman mythology, it was always, even though there was gods and goddesses, there was always a ruling god, and it was always male. And so I don't believe, for me, I don't personally interpret that as truth. I see that as a societal culture that was created through more or less a caveman mentality that's then filtered through. So we view spirituality through that filter of what we witness. So if there is something out there that's all powerful, if there is something out there that is part of our lives and moving us through these challenges and triumphs and all of that, and is in many ways a benefactor, then also we would perceive that as a male because that's what we see reflected in our society. So when we look at, and why I teach spiritual sovereignty is I simply want to start, asking the questions. If you weren't taught through your religion that God is male, would you perceive God as male? Because many indigenous communities didn't perceive this source as male. It wasn't, their societies weren't set up in kind of that patriarchy. They simply said, yes, there's something there. Some of them had called it Gaia, or it was a matriarchal. So again, we're projecting onto that source this human body, this human reality. But that is so backward, because then we're taking this physical human dimension and we're projecting that out onto what creator is, versus letting creator be whatever creator is and receiving that guidance through that neutral awareness. Now, for all I know, God is male. For all I know, God is female. But we don't know, and that's what's so beautiful about this. When we can sit into this place of surrender of I don't know, and then simply witness what is, then I feel like then we begin to get the sense of the truth of it. Because can that source show up with masculine attributes? Can that source also show up with feminine attributes? Absolutely. And is it one or the other, or is it all, and is it both? So that's the way I perceive and consider God.